The wind does not howl here. It screams. It tears across the frozen emptiness at speeds that would knock a grown man off his feet, carrying with it a cold so absolute that exposed flesh begins to freeze in under 60 seconds. The temperature hovers at 40 below zero, though in these latitudes, such distinctions become meaningless. Cold is cold, and everything is trying to kill you. Now imagine standing at the edge of this frozen ocean. Behind you lies the only land you have ever known. Ahead, stretching to the horizon and beyond, lies nothing but ice. Shifting, groaning, cracking ice that could swallow you whole without warning. No maps, no rescue, no promise that anything waits on the other side. And yet, you step forward. You begin to walk, because somewhere in the human mind exists a spark that refuses to accept the impossible. This is the story of how our ancestors crossed frozen oceans without dying. Not through luck, not through divine intervention, but through an accumulation of knowledge so precise, so hard-won, that it transformed the deadliest environment on Earth into a pathway home. To understand how humans survived the frozen world, we must first understand why the frozen world is so determined to kill us. We are tropical animals. Our bodies evolved under African sun, designed to shed heat, not preserve it. We sweat. We have minimal body hair. Our circulatory system pumps blood close to the surface of our skin. Everything about our biology represents a catastrophic mismatch with polar environments. When core body temperature drops just 2 degrees below normal, cognitive function begins to deteriorate. At 4 degrees below, the heart starts to fail. The cold does not simply threaten discomfort, it threatens the fundamental chemical processes that keep us alive. And yet, humans have lived in Arctic regions for at least 45,000 years. They did not merely survive, they thrived. They built cultures. They raised families. They crossed distances that would challenge modern expeditions equipped with satellite technology and synthetic insulation. The question is not whether they accomplished this. The question is how. The answer begins with observation. Generations of observation, so patient, so meticulous, that it borders on the obsessive. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic developed survival systems that took centuries to perfect, each element building upon lessons learned through trial and fatal error. When European explorers first encountered these techniques, they often dismissed them as primitive. This arrogance killed many of them. Consider clothing. A European explorer of the 19th century might arrive in the Arctic wearing wool and leather, materials that seemed logical to temperate minds. Wool insulates, leather blocks wind. But wool absorbs moisture, and moisture conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than dry air. A man sweating in wool will freeze faster than a man wearing nothing at all. The Inuit understood this. Their clothing systems used caribou hide with the fur facing inward, creating a layer of trapped air that provided insulation without absorbing perspiration. Multiple loose layers allowed moisture to escape while maintaining warmth. Seams were carefully positioned to prevent heat loss at critical points. Every element served a purpose refined across generations. But clothing alone could not cross an ocean. To travel across frozen seas, you needed to understand the ice itself. And ice is not static. It breathes. It moves. It remembers the forces that shaped it. Sea ice forms in stages, each with different properties that determine whether it can bear weight or will shatter beneath your feet. New ice, thin and dark, bends before it breaks. It might support a single person moving quickly, but will crack under sustained pressure. First-year ice, thicker and stronger, can handle sleds and dogs. Multi-year ice, having survived at least one summer melt, becomes harder and more stable, but also more unpredictable, riddled with pressure ridges and hidden weaknesses. Knowing which ice to trust required reading signs invisible to untrained eyes. The color of the surface, the sound it made when struck, the way snow accumulated in certain patterns. Indigenous hunters spent lifetimes developing this literacy, and they passed it down as carefully as any sacred text. Navigation presented another seemingly impossible challenge. How do you find your way across a featureless white expanse where landmarks do not exist and magnetic compasses behave erratically near the poles? The Inuit and other Arctic peoples developed orientation systems based on wind direction, snowdrift patterns, star positions, and the subtle behavior of ice formations. They memorized the shapes of coastlines with such precision that they could sketch accurate maps from memory, maps that later proved more reliable than those created by European cartographers with instruments. They read the sky for signs of open water, knowing that dark patches reflected in clouds indicated ice-free zones below. They understood that survival meant becoming part of the environment, not fighting against it. The psychology of these journeys remains difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. We live in a world of immediate communication, of rescue services, of the unspoken assumption that help exists somewhere if we need it badly enough. The people who crossed frozen oceans had none of this. They left knowing that failure meant death, that no one would come looking, that every decision carried absolute consequences. This awareness produced a relationship with risk that we have largely lost. Caution was not cowardice. Patience was not weakness. The willingness to wait, sometimes for days or weeks, until conditions aligned perfectly represented the highest form of intelligence. Dogs played a role that extended far beyond simple transportation. Sled dogs could detect thin ice before humans noticed any warning signs, their instincts honed by the same evolutionary pressures that shaped their master's knowledge. A lead dog hesitating for no apparent reason was a message to be heeded without question. The relationship between humans and dogs in Arctic travel was not domestication in the simple sense. It was partnership, a merging of sensory capabilities that made both species more capable than either alone. Food storage and hunting techniques completed the survival equation. Crossing frozen oceans often meant traveling for weeks between hunting opportunities. The Inuit developed methods of preserving meat that required no fire and no salt, using natural freezing and careful butchering to maintain nutrition across extended journeys. They understood which animals provided the fat content necessary for generating body heat. They knew that consuming frozen raw meat actually preserved more nutrients than cooking. What appeared to European observers as barbarism was in fact nutritional science developed through empirical testing across centuries. The kayak, though primarily associated with open water, served crucial functions in ice travel as well. Leads of open water appear unpredictably in sea ice, and the ability to navigate these channels often meant the difference between reaching a destination and becoming trapped on a drifting ice floe. The kayak's enclosed design prevented water from entering even in rough conditions, while its light weight allowed a single person to carry it across solid ice. It was not a boat in the European sense. It was an extension of the body, a survival tool so refined that modern engineers study its hull dynamics with admiration. Now let us turn to one of history's most dramatic examples of frozen ocean crossing, one that shaped the genetic destiny of entire continents. Sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, humans walked from Asia to North America. They crossed not open ocean but Beringia, a vast landmass exposed by lower sea levels during the Ice Age. Yet calling this a simple land crossing misses the brutal reality. Beringia was a frozen steppe environment stretching over 1,000 miles, inhabited by predators and offering limited resources to travelers. Temperatures regularly dropped far below what most modern humans have ever experienced. The people who made this journey carried with them only what they could hold and wore only what they had learned to make. These first Americans represented a culmination of technological and cultural knowledge accumulated across thousands of generations in Northeast Asia. They knew how to hunt large mammals cooperatively. They knew how to process hides and bones into tools and shelter. They knew how to read weather patterns and animal behavior. Most importantly, they knew how to teach these skills to their children with enough fidelity that nothing essential was lost across generations. This cultural transmission system was itself a technology, perhaps the most important one of all. What drove them forward? Theories vary. Pursuit of game animals, population, pressure from behind, simple human curiosity, the same impulse that later sent ships around the world and rockets into space. Whatever the motivation, they walked into the unknown carrying only their accumulated wisdom, and they emerged on the other side to become the ancestors of every indigenous culture, from Alaska to Patagonia. The Arctic explorers of the European age approached the frozen world with different assumptions and often with tragic results. Expedition after expedition vanished into the white, their members dying of starvation, scurvy, and exposure while surrounded by food sources that indigenous peoples had harvested for millennia. The Franklin expedition of 1845 represents the most famous example. 129 men, equipped with the finest technology Victorian Britain could provide, disappeared into the Canadian Arctic and never returned. Evidence suggests they died slowly, some resorting to cannibalism, none successfully adapting to the environment they had entered. Why did they fail where indigenous peoples succeeded? The answer lies partly in arrogance, partly in the limitations of their knowledge systems. European explorers arrived with preconceived notions about superiority that prevented them from learning from the people who had already solved the problems they faced. They carried canned food that poisoned them with lead rather than learning to hunt seals. They wore fabric that absorbed their sweat and froze against their skin rather than adopting fur clothing. They insisted on naval discipline and rigid hierarchy rather than the flexible decision-making that Arctic survival required. Their failure was not a failure of courage or determination. It was a failure of epistemology, an inability to recognize that knowledge could exist outside their own cultural framework. Some explorers did learn. Robert Peary, whatever controversies surround his claims to have reached the North Pole, understood the value of indigenous methods. He traveled with Inuit guides, wore Inuit clothing, ate Inuit food, and built igloos rather than carrying heavy canvas tents. Roald Amundsen, the first to successfully navigate the Northwest Passage and later the first to reach the South Pole, spent years studying with indigenous Arctic peoples before attempting his expeditions. These men survived not because they were stronger or braver than those who perished, but because they were humble enough to learn. The science of cold survival has progressed enormously since those early expeditions. We now understand the physiological mechanisms of hypothermia in clinical detail. We know how vasoconstriction redirects blood from extremities to protect core organs. We know how the body burns fat reserves to generate heat, and how this process eventually depletes energy stores beyond recovery. We have developed synthetic materials that insulate without absorbing moisture, that block wind without trapping perspiration. We have built shelters that can withstand polar storms and vehicles that can cross terrain that would have stopped any previous generation. And yet, modern research increasingly confirms what indigenous peoples knew all along. The most effective approaches to cold survival remain fundamentally unchanged. Layer clothing loosely. Keep dry at all costs. Eat fat-rich foods. Travel with the environment rather than against it. Read the ice before trusting it. Never assume that technology can substitute for knowledge. Our instruments have grown more sophisticated, but the principles they validate were discovered long before any instrument existed. There is something humbling in this realization. We live in an age that celebrates innovation, that assumes newer always means better, that trusts technology to solve problems our ancestors could not. Yet when we examine how humans actually conquered the frozen world, we find that the solutions were not technological in the modern sense. They were cultural. They were accumulated through patient observation across generations. They were transmitted through teaching and storytelling and practice. They required not just intelligence, but wisdom. The kind of wisdom that cannot be rushed or purchased or invented in a laboratory. The frozen oceans our ancestors crossed no longer exist in the same form. Climate change has altered ice patterns that remained stable for thousands of years. The Northwest Passage, that legendary route that killed so many European explorers, now opens regularly in summer months. The Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth, and the knowledge systems that evolved to navigate it face unprecedented challenges. Indigenous communities must now adapt not to the cold they mastered, but to the thaw they never anticipated. Perhaps this is the final lesson of the frozen crossing. Survival has always required adaptation, the willingness to observe changing conditions and modify behavior accordingly. Our ancestors did not survive because they perfected a single approach and repeated it forever. They survived because each generation paid attention, learned from experience, and adjusted to what the world actually presented rather than what they expected to find. This flexibility, this responsiveness, this refusal to become trapped by past assumptions, may prove more valuable than any specific technique they developed. When you stand in a warm room today, separated from the cold by walls and heating systems and all the accumulated infrastructure of modern life, it becomes easy to forget that the barrier is thin. The cold has not disappeared. It waits just beyond the boundary we have constructed. And should that boundary ever fail, should the systems we depend upon ever falter, we might find ourselves facing the same challenges our ancestors faced, with far less knowledge of how to meet them. They crossed frozen oceans without dying because they refused to see the environment as an enemy to be conquered. They saw it as a system to be understood, a puzzle whose solution required patience and humility and generations of accumulated wisdom. They walked into conditions that should have killed them, and they emerged on the other side carrying the genetic and cultural heritage that eventually became us. We are all descendants of people who survived the impossible. This is not metaphor. This is the literal truth of human existence. Every person alive today carries the legacy of ancestors who faced extinction-level challenges and found ways to continue. The frozen crossing was one of those challenges. The fact that we exist at all is proof that it was met. So the next time the wind blows cold against your face, consider for a moment what that sensation meant to the ones who came before. Consider the knowledge they accumulated and the courage they required, and the sheer stubborn refusal to accept that any environment, no matter how hostile, could prevent human passage. They crossed frozen oceans without dying, and in doing so, they proved something about our species that remains true today. We are not limited by our biology. We are not constrained by the conditions we were designed to inhabit. We are capable, when necessity demands and wisdom permits, of walking through the impossible and emerging alive on the other side.